Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And thank you, Pascal, for letting me spend time.
Nice touch. No, I thought it was funny.
All right, are we ready to roll,
All right.
folks?
Yeah.
All good, Patrick, Stephen? Yes?
Yeah, we're good, thanks.
Awesome. So I think we will get started with our very last conversation of the week of the series of conversations in arts and science. Maybe I'll just take this opportunity to thank audience members who have come through the space. We see some nice familiar faces here, and some people came multiple times, so I'm really grateful for that. And also on Zoom, we see some kind of repeat customers, so thank you so much for being here and joining us virtually. And most of all, thank you to Patrick and Rebecca for putting this together, all the sorts of hard work and organization behind the scenes for months now to make this week happen, so we really appreciate collaborating with you always, and in this particular instance as well, to have so many great conversations with researchers that we don't always get the time to take deep dives with in terms of the work that they're doing. So it's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Alrighty, that's it for me. The very last time for the week, over to Associate Dean of Research, Patrick Leroux, to introduce his next guest.
Thank you, Anna. Our last guest this week, for this introductory series of conversations on research in the Faculty of Arts and Science. So you're the 17th researcher I speak to and mostly listen to this week. So how many are left? We have 490 odd professors, and if you include the part-timers, because our part-timers are doing fascinating work as well, that's closer to 900. So I could be doing this for years. Stephen, thank you for joining us today. We'll be talking about the Middle Ages and digital culture, as these are your two principal areas of interest and research, and you found ways to create convergence between them. So Stephen is a full professor in the Department of English, promoted this year. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
He's published, first monograph was From Lawmen to Plowmen, Anglo-Saxon Legal Tradition and the School of Langland. I love props, and it's a book. Imagine that. I can touch it, and I won't get lost in my computer. And I could drop coffee on it. And he's also published most recently Old Media and the Medieval Concept, Media Ecologies Before Early Modernity. And this also exists digitally, published with Concordia University Press. And I encourage you, I think there's like a video also where you talk about it. So I definitely encourage you to go have a look at the Concordia University Press website and discover more about this book.
We with my co-editor Thora Brilo, we did a launch in Fourth Space, which I think is probably
right here.
available. Yes, that's right.
Great. So everything is in everything.
Right.
Welcome back.
Yeah.
You arrived at Concordia most recently in 2012, so you were a limited term agreement, LTA, full-time assistant professor here for 2 years.
Yeah.
We lost you to Wayne State for a bit, but you came back, and we're happy to have you back. Your PhD was in English from the University of Toronto with a certificate from the collaborative program in editing medieval texts. So perhaps that's part of your fascination for the digital world as well. We'll dig into that in a moment. You've obtained funding from the FRQ, SSHRC, initially looking at old media and the medieval concept, but also most recently, and this is fascinating, notions of the global far north from the year 500 to 1500, and from hallway conversations we've had, you've definitely expanded my mind on how we think of the global north. You've also written articles, book chapters, many conferences. I could go on, but I think we should dive in. So we'll start perhaps more generally, and then elaborate on some of the work you're doing. But how are the Middle Ages related to digital culture?
I mean, it's funny to sort of get into that, which is that at a certain point in doing this research, I realized that the question isn't so much how did the Middle Ages relate to digital culture as it is, why is it that everybody assumes that they're related even though they're not, right?
Right.
Because there is no actual obvious connection between computers and wizards and knights and jousting and what have you, and yet those are interests that people usually share together, right? I mean, beginning with myself, they say that every research project is in part an autobiography. As a young person, I was interested in computers and the internet from a very sort of early phase, and I played Dungeons and Dragons, and obviously had an interest in medieval. I remember reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight in high school, and so I had those interests myself, and many of my colleagues do. And when I started looking into it, I saw that this was not just a kind of a feature of our moment. This has actually been a feature of digital culture back to the beginning of the computer. The first major digital humanities project that people often cite as the first major one is a concordance to the works of Thomas Aquinas that was done with IBM on like tape and things in like 1969 or something. And medieval studies, which is not really on the vanguard of a lot of critical trends, have been on the vanguard of the digital humanities throughout the entire period. Textual criticism is just one example of this. And so also, back to Stanford in the 1960s, they were not only were early computer games like Adventure, which was this sort of travel through caves kind of Dungeons and Dragons based game, extremely important to the beginning of computers, where there was an estimate that something like over 50% of the computing capacity of America at one point was occupied with playing this game in all of these labs. But to go back to the Stanford example, they would even have the rooms in the labs named after locations from Middle Earth. So the Middle Ages and digital culture are related in our culture, and my investigations have really been about trying to articulate why that is.
Right, and what drew you initially to that connection?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a long story. I mean, it really actually began in 2012 when I returned to Concordia. That our colleague Darren Werschler and Bart Simon and the Technoculture Arts Games, they I guess knew about my interest in digital humanities. We started talking. I sort of sat in on some of their meetings, and I became interested in their work, and as it pertains specifically to medievalism, as they call it in games, which is to say games that aren't set in the historical Middle Ages, but where we understand them to be medieval because there are elves and swords and things, right?
Okay.
And then from there, at a certain point, I just sort of took a step back and was like, why, right? Why is it that this is so intuitive? That it's difficult to even articulate a research question.
These figures, these medieval
figures?
Well,
here's one way of putting it, that if you were in a given office space in North America and you needed to find somebody who knew the rules of jousting, then you would start in the IT department, right? That this is just a sort of shared, this is a stereotype about geek culture,
right.
But it's not just a stereotype, it's true, right?
Okay.
These interests converge. And this symbolic vocabulary overlaps, and that has been the case since computers were invented. So that's basically what my investigations have been about, is just sort of trying to tease out, what is the evidence for that? Where does beyond the anecdotal, and also what does it mean?
Right, and what have you found so far? What does it mean? Do you have some hypotheses that you're working from? Yeah,
I mean, my general sense at the moment is that for a number of historical reasons, the symbolic vocabulary of medieval history and romance, especially the genre of medieval romance, is the symbolic vocabulary that we use to think about what life is like online, what it's like to be mediated in general, but especially mediated through digital culture. So whenever there's so I mean, a famous example is William Gibson's 1984 novel Neuromancer, which has coined the term cyberspace. This famous and very influential on the development of tech culture, right? Like, if you were going to work in the internet in the 90s, you had to know that novel, right? The title of the novel is Neuromancer, right? A pun on necromancer, which is a post-classical term for a magician who can speak to the dead, right? So there at the very and what that novel is essentially a Grail quest for the Neuromancer.
Yeah.
So there's the story. There's an extremely important formative story that really sort of sparked the imagination of what digital culture would look like at the moment of when it's coming into being, and it's entirely predicated on medieval romance and this medieval notion of magic.
Fascinating. And you flipped this around also, because you taught a class on Tolkien.
Right.
Tolkien and Old English, but using online teaching tools. Could you talk about that and how that went and how this was even possible to develop within the university?
Yeah, well, I partnered with the Concordia quite early on. I developed the course in 2014.
Right, so at the very beginning.
Yeah, at the very beginning of the of Knowledge One, and it was a great time to do it because they were super keen on it, right? That I had the advantage of a lot of attention and engagement from the professionals there, and it was a wonderful experience working with them. And very early on in the process, I had originally had the idea like, well, our department needs online courses. I would like people to take Old English. I think it's a great subject. And so we'll have an online course and it'll be in Old English. And I chose this angle of tying it to Tolkien because I had thought that it was a way of kind of solving the problem of making an Old English course a literature course in addition to a language course.
Right.
For the folks at home who don't know, Tolkien was a professor of Old English. That was his day job, and The Hobbit borrows directly in many ways from Old English literature. And so the conceit of the class is that we learn the language and then we translate the passages of Old English that Tolkien drew from. So the mentions of elves and dwarves and the riddles that are like the ones that Gollum told. So anyway, so I had developed this class, and then I had gone to Knowledge One to make it an online class, and they were like, "Have you considered gamifying it?" And I had not, but I was like, "You are Smaug, and you are collecting treasure for your cave," okay. and then it all just sort of ballooned from there. And the course, it looks beautiful, and it has that sort of strong game element, which students tell me is a big feature of the course for them.
Okay.
That this really actually quite simple game of they complete a quiz and then they get an item for their hoard. Right. They love it, and there's a leaderboard and they get very competitive.
Okay.
But it is another example of this, though, that it's like the kind of people who would be interested in the Old English and who would enjoy that gamification component. It tends to be the same kinds of people, and so it is. It's a good point that it was something that sort of went into my thinking about this, that it was so natural,
Do they also translate, what was it, runes? There's various languages in the...
There's a couple of runes that they use in Old English, but we don't really talk about them much in the Tolkien's Old English class.
And how literate are they in translation in this mode of learning? Because there's a gaming aspect. Do you test the level of translation? I'm curious to understand how this works in terms of translation literacy and efficacy. Yeah,
well, so my logic with designing the class is that it was in some ways I guess a critique of the Old English pedagogy, the traditional Old English pedagogy that I had come up with, where you know, I would go to class and we would go around the room and translate our sentences, and I would never be prepared. And I would just say, okay, well, I'm 3 sentences from now because he's here. And then I would translate my sentence and not listen to those 3 sentences. So I didn't learn anything in class.
Right.
It was all like meeting up with classmates outside of class and working together on the translation that I actually learned the language. And so my idea with the course was to, for groups, in small groups, to produce translations collaboratively, and then to share those translations with the other groups and have everyone sort of correct each other's group's translations, and only then at the end come in with the answer. So that's basically the structure of the way that the translation works. And you know, in Old English, you know, there are unfortunately no living speakers of Old English or any, and you know, often the most interesting research questions are about the words where nobody has any idea. There's this one
pronunciation or meaning.
Well, there's a word garsage, which means ocean.
Okay.
It looks like it's a compound word, and the most obvious thing for it to be is spearman. And why does spearman mean ocean? Like maybe we're wrong and it doesn't mean
Triton.
Maybe it's a reference to Triton. Maybe it's like a, you know, maybe it got corrupted and it was something else that made more sense. But we just have this word, and we can infer from the context what it means, but we don't understand. And it's just an example of how, you know, in a heritage language with such historical distance, you know, what you're often after isn't so much an exact translation as it is a kind of understanding of what the questions are, right? Because that's often what the research is about, is like the different explanations, and maybe you have a new explanation where garsage came from, or what have you, right?
And is this, this course in particular, but also some of the other teaching you're doing and some of the exciting research you're doing, is this promoting the study of medieval literature, of Old English, within the department and within the field? Is it attracting people who otherwise would not have taken that route?
Yeah, I mean, that's really, I mean, I'm very aware in my pedagogy, in my research of, what are people's ways into things, and what sort of gets them excited, what gets them asking the questions, and you know, why do they care? You know, I mean, medieval studies is a field that has changed profoundly since World War II, basically, and you know, because of the decline of the British Empire, right? It's a language that where the study of Old English rose to prominence as part of an imperial project, pretty explicitly. And you know, that is one of the things that's actually interesting about it, to sort of explore how that imperial project has shaped the language and what have you. But you know, it's the language and the legacy of it, and what's interesting about it, and the culture and the history that it represents. You know, it intersects in different ways with the present that the video games and digital culture medieval studies thing is just an example of, right? Tolkien is there a more popular author or influential author in world letters, right? We were just talking today about this this TV show, the most expensive TV show of all time, which is based on the appendices to the 3rd volume of his fantasy trilogy, right? You know, there's more, obviously, like the legacy of the Project of Empire is part of what's going on there, but I think that there's more to it, and there's definitely more that it could be. There are many examples of people who take up the fantasy genre or take up medieval history and explore it in different ways, and so I see it as my responsibility then to facilitate those explorations.
So I find this interesting, how Old English in this context can be, I guess, a symptom, a result of a waning colonial project. And I'm interested in how you're framing that. So do you see Old English basically going the route of the study of Sanskrit and Latin? But at the same time, we're also seeing, as you mentioned, resurgence and interest in this medieval or medieval inflected, inspired literature. I guess you could have gone entirely that way, and yet you came up with colleagues, of course, with this idea of the the medieval global north.
Yes.
So how did you get to that project, and where are you going with this? I'm
Yeah.
absolutely fascinated, because you've been looking at texts and originally exegesis and various ancient manuscripts in digital form and whatnot. But by going up north, I guess you'll be shedding the text to some extent, right? You go into oral histories. You go. What are you studying, and how does this change our idea of medieval?
So you're right that like the study of Old English, even like sort of the very sort of square, old school study of Old English, yeah, it's the study of manuscripts, but there aren't that many, and the ones that survive are fragmentary, and I mean, like take Beowulf for example, right? Like the national epic of England, right? The most foundational text in the entire period, and it's in a single manuscript. There's nothing that's even really, the closest analogs to it are either way later and elsewhere, or it's really like a very unique object, which barely survived a fire in the 17th century. The Exeter book, this famous manuscript of poems like The Wanderer and The Seafarer, the famous Old English elegies. What we can tell from the manuscript is that, there's a poem, The Ruin, which was ruined when somebody put a hot poker on it when it was in the blacksmith's shop. We can tell from the cover of it that it was used as a cutting board in the kitchen for a while, and probably for 100 years it used to prop up the leg of a table, right? This stuff that survives is, it's an accident that we have any of it. Right. And so actually moving beyond the text to try to reconstruct the world beyond it in any way that you can is already part of the mandate of medieval studies. But in terms of the Global Far North project, I was sort of specifically thinking about important examples of these fragmentary texts, which are the stories of Leif Erikson, right? The Greenlander saga and Eric the Red saga, which are the stories about the travels to Vinland, wherever that is, right? In some case, some people think that they went up the St. Lawrence.
Right.
They probably never left Newfoundland, but
yeah, most likely Newfoundland.
Yeah. And so I just started thinking about there's a problem that comes with the fixation on writing and the importance of needing a written attestation for it to be history, which is that those texts have a long history of erasing indigenous cultural knowledge about that period, right? And that it gets privileged over it, even though it's like, so in the passage that's maybe going up the St. Lawrence, they see a guy who's hopping around on one leg who then throws a spear and hits the guy in the gut. And it's like, I think that probably didn't actually happen. I don't think there were one-legged people actually hopping around in Newfoundland or in Quebec, right?
It makes for a good story.
Yeah, it made for a good story. And so, why privilege that as history over indigenous knowledge? It doesn't. Right. Just because it's written down. That's really kind of what it comes down to. And so, so the idea of the Global Far North project is really to partner, especially with indigenous researchers. And so, the short-term goal of that project is really to build networks between indigenous researchers within and outside of medieval studies, to move towards the goal, which is to contextualize that contact in Newfoundland in the larger context of cultural contact around the North Pole, because in fact there was quite a bit of it for all of recorded history. It was to go from Iceland to in the exact same period, in fact, when they're coming from Iceland to Greenland, you've got folks coming from what's now northern Alaska. Right. At the same time to Greenland, right? And so these multiple overlapping networks of exchange and movement, which makes sense because you're talking about the seal hunt and what have you, right? There's no particular reason to privilege Leif Erikson over any number of other instances of contact around the global far north, but we don't really have all of those histories accessible, and so that's the project.
Right, and you had the Venetians heading up to the Faroe Islands, the tail end of that period. You've got a lot of traveling happening.
And outside of Europe, right? Like outside of the European context that don't involve Europeans. And that's really the part that I
And
would like to
how
know
do you
more
do
about.
this? So how do you gather a team? Because the team will, I guess, necessarily be multinational,
Right.
Multilingual. You
Yeah.
have indigenous knowledge, and so their idea of medieval times is not necessarily, doesn't correspond to, it's not their Middle Ages, right?
No,
It
no,
doesn't
it's
correspond-
well, it's really interesting. Like
so
one
how
of the
do
great
they-
barriers to what's called the global Middle Ages is
Yeah.
this sort of research area that I'm kind of moving into, and one of the great problems is everybody else hates the idea of being labeled as medieval because of course it is pejorative, right? The term
right, it has become,
means you know. Well, I mean, it was designed to be pejorative in the 15th century when the term was coined, right? It used to be just antiquitas and modernitas were the two eras and then they add the media iva, or you know, the mediating ages in the 15th century is when you first start to see the occurrences of it, and by the 18th century, it specifically means the time that you should ignore. Though this actually brings us all the way back to the beginning, because what's the problem with the Middle Ages? Why are we so mad at them? And what it comes down to is that you know, modernity, beginning in the 15th century, is really interested in antiquitas. They're interested in the Roman Empire. This is at the burgeoning of a new era of European empire. They want to go back to the Roman model, but they can't because virtually no original Roman texts survive. Everything that does survive is in a medieval manuscript, and copied often in contexts where they weren't especially interested in returning to the age of empire, or it was like way too far, like it wasn't possible or whatever. These medieval manuscripts then are very frustrating because they mediate this classical antiquity. And so to go back to where I started, like what is it about the Middle Ages that makes it so appropriate for thinking about the experience of living in mediated digital culture is that the era was defined as the Middle Ages from the very beginning as an era of mediation. And that concept of mediation, of media technology, which has its affordances and frustrations for communication, is a philosophical concept that arose specifically through frustration with medieval manuscripts.
And what mediation was happening in the global far north, as you've discovered so far with your team?
Well, I mean, it's the mediation of this history, right? So the mediation
through what
is
forms? Through because you've talked about the manuscripts.
Right.
Are there other manifestations? I don't know, architectural.
Well, there are two main kinds. There's indigenous traditional knowledge, but although there are the you know, I mean, the question of how to access that respectfully and in collaboration with the communities is something that you know, is one of the reasons why this is a long-term project, right? And the second is there's tons of information. You know, what you might call archaeological information, which you might call geological. You know. The fluctuation of the ice ages, for example, like the history of the climate is actually extremely important to the study of this, because there's this big question about because they're in Greenland for like 300 years, and then they just sort of leave and they say, oh well, it's because of an ice age, but that's controversial. You know, so there's all kinds of information. One that interests me especially is what do they call it? The study of the history of diseases. So one of the big growth areas in medieval studies right now, especially a woman, Monica Green, writing about the history of the plague, which they can now do by sort of doing genetic sequences of, I guess like you can tell if a corpse died of the plague because of the teeth. And so they can then sample and sequence the strains of the plague. And they've reconstructed this whole sort of history of the trajectory of the plague, which, among other things, tells you about networks of cultural contact. Because it's like, if this strain is in Central Europe, and then like 50 years later, it's in Spain, then there must be, you know, I mean Central Asia, excuse me, and you know, then obviously those lines of cultural exchange were more robust than we thought, for example.
Right.
So one thing that I think that would be possible would be to do something similar in terms of human remains in the global far north. Though, of course, there again you have the ethical issues,
Right.
and needing the partnerships and what have you. So, I mean, that's why I'm focusing, I guess, on building the cohort of researchers and the connections with Indigenous researchers and Indigenous communities at the beginning, because we can't even really get to the question of what's possible before we've answered the question of what's appropriate, right?
Mhm.
So that's that's the way it's going right now.
Okay. And so you're training eventual Indigenous medievalists?
Well,
that's the
or
idea?
current Indigenous
Right,
medievalists
okay,
who've,
yeah.
who've, you know, they've completed their PhDs in early career, and
Nice.
yeah, it's and training. There's a Horizon postdoctoral fellowship
Mm-hmm.
for an Indigenous scholar. He's from Indigenous studies, but working in this sort of historical context as well, and sort of. So really, like the networking of scholars is where I'm beginning. So I mean, like, who is it who's mediating this? It's us, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's we're the living products of history, and it's up to us to kind of figure out what that means, and then how to access what we can and learn from it.
So I'm discovering an ever-evolving field. What you're describing is transdisciplinary. It's opening up like complicated questions. When you mentioned what's appropriate to research and how it might be appropriate or inappropriate, you're also bringing into question a number of research methods.
Yeah.
You're questioning the field as well, and the very notion of medieval literature. I really like how you've reminded us of the mediating ethos, basically, in this literature, but also beyond the literature, this entire culture that permeates us still, that continues to live within us. Do you sense that this new line of inquiry will perhaps eliminate our phantasmagorical relationship to the medieval?
Oh, I don't even know if that's possible. I mean, it's I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, that there is this kind of English, French, European cultures, like the Middle Ages is their infancy, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
the moment where everything sort of comes together, and where the history of these cultures begin. So as long as these identities exist in whatever form, then that moment will remain important, right? Because identities are defined by their histories and the narratives that structure them, and so the medieval remains that, as long as those identities remain even just areas of interest, right? As long as people still ask about them or try to understand them, then the medieval has that value. And and also there's just the intrinsic interest of it. I've mentioned Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Like those are just wonderful books. And actually, and what you discover, and what the encounter that I try to make for students is, when you actually go back to this stuff, and you aren't looking at it for what it means symbolically today, but just to engage with it, it's so weird. It doesn't. You don't come to it and find your expectations met or reflected. It's like, oh, that's wow. You really spent a lot of time listing every kind of bird. I don't know why that's so interesting to you, but it's interesting that it is, right? It has that. That thing that you want out of an encounter with a cultural object, which is a new perspective, a different way of experiencing the world, that then you can sort of add into your sort of growing sense of the tapestry of human experience. Medieval literature is very rich in those kinds of things, and it's not unique in that way, of course, but it is something that gives the text value, and that I look for opportunities to showcase for people, I guess.
What is it that drives your research and your teaching in medieval literature and society generally?
Curiosity, really. I mean, you know, when I chose the period, you know, way back in graduate school days, I was drawn to that it was kind of the closest you could get to not actually choosing a period. I mean, like, you know, conservatively, it's 1,000 years, right? And things like genre or different sorts of disciplines of knowledge barely exist in a way that matters. And so you kind of have to learn about everything and you can just sort of wander around, right? And so I love that aspect of reading a new medieval text and just like, even now, you know, after years of studying it and, you know, becoming a nominal expert in it, its capacity to surprise me every time I encounter something new is something that I love. But, you know, but there's also, at the same time, like there's a certain level of basic knowledge and ability to skills to just see exactly how weird or surprising something is. You know, otherwise you might just sort of shrug, but if you kind of say like, well, wait, it's like, given all of this and this and this, then really that's what you're going to say or that's what you're going to do? That you kind of need that context to understand just how striking and unexpected a question can be. And so that's what I that's what I pursue myself, that's what I enjoy, and that's what I try to communicate to students, you know, is these questions about these, I don't know, these very strange texts, which don't get any less strange the more often you read them.
Right, so you don't rationalize them, you just allow them to be strange.
Well, you describe them and try to understand them, right? I mean, the discipline, as far as I'm concerned, is to not project yourself into it, right? It's to allow that strangeness to be an occasion for self-reflection and greater self-understanding, right? Why do people care about history anyway? Like, why does it really matter to me, you know, what happened in Newfoundland 800 years ago?
Right.
But it really matters to people, and that's interesting. And you know, there are things that I can learn about myself and my world and the way that I engage with others through knowing about what happened then, right? And so the trick, though, is to not just let that new knowledge merely reinforce what I already thought.
So in medieval studies, I guess for the longest time, one would hope to discover a text in the library in some abbey or some old castle.
Still very possible.
Yeah, so perhaps we'll be surprised by a treasure trove of ancient or old manuscripts as the classics were renewed with that discovery about 20 years ago in Egypt. Do you expect that? Do you hope that? Or are projects like the Global Far North the way to go for the future of medieval studies?
No, I mean, it would be great to, forgotten lost treasures are I mean, and there's so much stuff in like private collections or, you know, and well, the history, of course, of medieval manuscripts is you know, this travesty, especially in England, of with the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, manuscripts basically just getting thrown into the trash, and or when they did, they would take it and they would just cut out the pretty pictures and then throw the rest of it away. I mean, like, there's a real history of that, which continues into the present even. There is always the possibility for new discoveries, but there's even the possibility for new discoveries in things that are actually like well cataloged in, because you know, there's the skills that you need to access it, and the interest in it, and you know, the perspective to actually like look at something that maybe didn't suit that project of empire, so everyone ignored it, but now that we're sort of past that, maybe we'll go back to it and we'll find something that actually interests us. There's so much basic primary work to be done in medieval studies. Like to make texts that are deeply fascinating available in modern editions is a task that you know, I could spend my entire career on it and not even scratch the surface, right? And we could have teams of people working around the clock, and it would take decades, right? So it is a very exciting field that way, actually. You don't even need that sort of like, you know, discovery of the lost manuscript, though that does happen and has happened, you know, not too long ago, to have this potential for discovery.
I don't know if you want to go there, but you mentioned teams working around the clock.
Right.
Well, we have AI, and we're actually weeks away, months away from quantum computing.
Well, sure, but like, let's say that it, but
yeah.
you know, you go to a website and they want to stop you from getting in there as a robot. What do? They show you something that looks like some writing from a medieval manuscript, and they make you recognize what the word is, right? So, I mean, you know, like it's actually like the automation of it is, you know, beyond the capacity of current computing.
Okay. So the answer doesn't necessarily lie in AI.
Well, no, I mean, there's, but again, like medieval studies is on the vanguard of all of this stuff, right? There are lots of people working on this, but mostly, I mean, they're really into like spectrographic analysis to try and, you know, because a lot of the most interesting texts are palimpsests, you know, that were sort of scraped off, and then they wrote something over it, and then you can still kind of read the thing underneath, but maybe it was left in a basement during World War II or something, and so it's all moldy, and so you got to get through the mold and the other writing to get, you know what I mean? So you got to do all of that sort of work before you can imagine doing something like training a computer to read that palimpsest and then transcribe it. You know what I mean? Like that's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
And so, but you know, people are doing it, right? People do work on it. Like there are all kinds of very robust projects along these lines.
And we have colleagues here who could work on the mold as well for an interdisciplinary team. So.
That's right, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. I'll open it up for questions because I'd like us to be able to expand the conversation. Are there questions online or in-house? Yes. There's a question here.
You mentioned being amazed and sometimes surprised by your field of studies and the text too. What was your biggest surprise?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it's my biggest surprise. I don't know. It's one of these things. You know that they do these studies about like how kids find it hard to remember learning something, right? That this is and I guess there's that. But I'm going to answer with one of the things that I discovered that I most enjoyed, which is that there is, you know, there's the medieval trials by ordeal, right? And there's one, the ordeals are things like Monty Python, you know, like where the witch, they sort of drop her in the water and there's one where you would boil oil and drop a stone into it, and then you had to reach in and pull the stone out, and then they would bandage your hand, and then would your hand have healed? These kinds of things. They're all pretty gnarly like that. But there was a special one just for priests where they had to swallow a largish lump of cheese and bread without choking on it. And your question made me think about like what I love going to medieval studies conferences to sort of see these arguments and just kind of learn about these things and just be like, what is this? And then learn what the argument is about it. So in this case, that's a sort of interesting ordeal. And then the argument was about whether or not this was a real thing that was like actually hard to do, or if this was like a sort of easy one that they made just for the priests so that they wouldn't have to do a real ordeal. And you know, so a lot of the talk was about like the different kinds of cheese and like, you know, whether or not it would have, you know, anyway, it was, but it was fascinating, and it's a good example, I guess, of what I mean when I say that endlessly surprised is like, you know, I think it was probably a special one just for priests myself. That's my own view, but also I don't actually know, right? This world is so foreign. The world where you would use an ordeal to try to resolve a criminal matter is one that I don't understand. And whether or not people actually believed that God was going to burn this guy's hand or not, or if this was just sort of like a fiction that they did because they had to do something, what they actually thought or felt or experienced as this all unfolded is completely mysterious to me. And all I can really do is just kind of learn like, well, apparently this is what they did, and just kind of see the description and like this paper that I'm paraphrasing from 10 years ago, of a wonderful paper with a great discussion afterwards. You know, what kind of cheese could it have been? What kind of bread? You know, like maybe this will help us to kind of think about it. But at the end of the day, you know, it just remains surprising. Yeah.
Any other questions online? No? Well, thank you. Stephen, it was a pleasure
Yeah.
to have you here with us to discuss old media, new media, the global far north and medieval literature, all in 45 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. And cheese, yeah.
And folks, that concludes our week of research and conversation in the Faculty of Arts and Science. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll just quickly remind you that we did live stream all of these conversations. So if you'd like to revisit any moment, please go to Concordia University's Fourth Space on YouTube, our YouTube channel, and you'll find them all there. Okay, bye everybody. Thanks again to Patrick.